Hi there! I know it's been a while. In case you forgot, my name's Katey, and this is my second channel, Katey One More Time, and here is the place I love to talk about books. My other channel is primarily tarot content, which I also love and am passionate about, but I needed a place where I could talk about books with people who love books. I am a bookseller. I've been a bookseller for a few years in a very niche esoteric bookshop. More recently, I got a new job in a children's bookstore here in Melbourne, and that's basically the reason I was away and I haven't really made too much content lately, primarily because working in retail at Christmas, especially in a new job, and a children's bookstore no less, at Christmas time, it was rough, what can I say? But I did read 115 books in 2021, and today I wanted to tell you about my 10 absolute favourite adult fiction reads. I do also want to make some videos for my favourite non-fiction, my favourite children's books, and even, maybe if I'm feeling spicy, my least favourite books of the year. But today, let's focus on the good. I want to talk about my 10 absolute highlights of 2021. For fiction anyway, and adult books at that, but you get the point. Let's dive right in. Oh, and I have actually kind of managed to rank them. I know, I'm shocked, but let's go. So coming in at number 10 was one of the very first books I finished in 2021, and that is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This book is a collection of short stories, and it is the only collection featured in this video. As with all short story collections, there were certainly a handful in here that didn't hit for me or didn't land for me in the same way that so much of this book did. I do have to say though, for a collection, it is rare for me to give 5 stars. Often, even ones that I really enjoy end up with 4 stars just because of that reality. The reality is that often there's a handful, 1 or 2 even, that I just don't love as much. Whereas with this one, the ones that I loved were so strong and the writing throughout was so good that I couldn't not give it 5 stars, even if there were 1 or 2 stories that I didn't love. Carmen Maria Machado has a very distinct and unique voice, and that's something I always love and appreciate so much about finding a new author. Their writing feels like it has personality, like it has style, and that is absolutely true for this author. I will say though, there were elements of it that reminded me of Margaret Atwood. There was something about like the psychology of it and just the language of it that reminded me of Margaret Atwood's writing. I'm a big fan of Margaret Atwood. She is basically the reason I fell in love with reading. I will say it's a little bit, it's more twisted, more brutal. Brutal is a good word. Darker as well, but it's got that Margaret Atwood vibe. You get an awful lot in this short volume. Like we get like elements of horror, like some gore as well, but there's also some like magical realism, fantasy, even like, I don't know, like absurdism sometimes it feels like. It's a bonkers ride, but with so many complex themes that just give you so much to chew on, and I could not put this down. There's also a few different styles throughout to like keep you interested. Like one of the story, I think it's called Especially Heinous, it's almost structured, it's like a SVU, is that the name of the show? Special Victims Unit. It's like almost like a parody of that show, and the short story is basically told through episode summaries. So like summaries of each of the episodes. And we basically like get an overview of the season and what happens. It's really interesting and very cleverly done. A lot of this also feels very sensual, but almost in like a dangerous, corrupted kind of way. Like it definitely makes you feel squirmy sometimes. It made me scared a few times. It made me deeply uncomfortable quite often, but in like the best way possible. My personal favorite story in here was the second to last, which is called The Resident. And it's about a woman who basically gets to go to like a writing retreat and stays with a bunch of writers who all are working on their own artistic projects. But things just get very dark and twisted and confusing very quickly, and it was brilliant. It had me on the edge of my seat. The writing was incredible, and this whole volume, it's not long, but it was one of the first books I read at the beginning of the year, and it's one that I'm still thinking about. It's wonderful. My 9th favourite fiction read of the year was Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by Cho Nam-ju, translated by Jamie Chang. This was incredible. This was another one that I read earlier on in the year. It's very short, obviously it's a translated work from Korea, and it was just wonderful. It's such a clever book too. It has quite a simple premise. Basically, Kim Ji-young, the woman who is our protagonist, she is essentially the most average sort of Korean woman. Like everything about her is as average can be. She's supposed to represent like this generation's working woman and what it's like to live in Korea, to live in a patriarchal society, to live under capitalism as this generic regular woman. So there are literally references in here providing like evidence as to like specific experiences that women go through or specific statistics that women experience of the world and in particular Korea. But I think, you know, it has a larger message about patriarchy and capitalism. And basically we follow Ji-young for like a good period of her life, like right from when she's very, very young up until sort of middle-aged, like present day. And we just see the effects and influence that oppression, misogyny, violence, both physical and psychological, just messaging and biases and assumptions and gender expectations and all of this sort of stuff. We just see how all of this wears her down, how the different treatment that she had versus her brother had, and how her family sort of put different expectations and obligations on her versus her brother, but also gave him different opportunities than they did her. To as she gets older and, you know, is in high school, and the dating experiences that she has and sort of the objectification that she experiences, and then moving into the working environment, the professional environment, and sort of the different rules and hierarchies that influence women and the expectations around having children, and then what that does to a career and just all of it. And just ultimately the impact this has on a human being, on the soul, on the mind. It's almost so simple, like, you know, almost like the archetypal Gen X Korean woman and what it's like to be her. Like that is such a simple premise, but the way that it's done is just incredible. Like I don't think it could have been executed any better. It's so effective and compelling, and I think it just tells a wonderful story of how harmful the patriarchy and institutionalized oppression is. I think I read this in one sitting. Like I said, I read it back in January, but like that is my memory of it, sitting on the couch and not being able to put it down. It's incredible. Now, switching gears a little bit for my 8th favorite book, this is Wonder Bookstore by Shinsuke Yoshitake. This is a really sweet, I mean, maybe you could argue that it's a children's book, but I don't think it is. It's basically a really gorgeous cartoon manga sort of situation, all about the wonder of bookshops. But it gets a little bit fantastical throughout, and I adore it. I think it's so fabulous. I picked this up while I was in Bateman's Bay visiting my grandmother. And I read it all in one go, like right there outside the bookshop while I was waiting to get picked up. And I like had tears of joy in my eyes. It almost seems silly. Like it literally took me like half an hour to read it, but I just adored it. It was just one of those moments in time that was such a wonderful experience. And like not all books that are about loving books and reading and bookshops work for me, but this one absolutely did. And I think it worked so well because it focused on the feeling and the joy rather than the reality. I don't know, because it sort of took the love of reading and the love of bookshops and sort of the wonderful worlds we discover within bookshops and just ran with that in a fantastical sort of way sometimes, in a ridiculous, absurdist sort of way. The joy was just bursting at the seams with joy. It was so fun. It's not even like a narrative. Like there's not actually a story in here. Almost every single spread is like a different little snapshot or exploration. The loose premise essentially is that the Wonder Bookstore is a bookshop that you can wander into and ask for literally anything. And they almost always will have something for you. So it's kind of like a magical bookstore is the idea. For example, readers can discover books that can only be read by moonlight or designed to be read by 2 people at once, books about underwater libraries or how to grow books on trees, and much, much more. It's just an adorable picture book celebrating bookstores and reading, and it just felt so imaginative and playful and joyful, and I couldn't help but smile and tear up when I was reading it. I loved it. My next book I actually read on my Kindle, so I don't have here to show you, but it was Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is the 3rd book in the Brown Sisters trilogy, and this has to be my favorite romance series that I've ever read. To be fair, I haven't read a lot, but a lot of what I have read I haven't loved. Like usually I sort of like enjoy it for what it is and move on. But these Brown sisters, like these are some of the most joyful, beautiful, sexy books I've ever read. And Eve Brown, I think, was just such a beautiful ending to a series. Even though I didn't want it to end, if it had to end, this was a good way for it to go out. This one follows Eve Brown, who is the youngest of the three sisters. And she basically is the impulsive, sort of not very well organized, not very well put together one. But she is, of course, fun, vibrant, and very sweet and very funny. And she basically ends up in a situation where she's working as a baker or a cook. I read this at the beginning of the year, clearly, in a little Airbnb. It is owned and run by Jacob, who is very sexy, but also a bit of a control freak, and he doesn't like Eve when they first meet. But she needs a job and he needs a cook, so they sort of are stuck with each other and things just get better from there. This did feel like a little bit more of a slow burn than the first two books, at least how I remember them. But to be fair, I did feel like it really suited these characters. I felt like the dynamic that they established from the beginning right up until the end just felt really organic, and it really made sense for both of the characters. And for that reason, it felt just really compelling. From the few romance books that I've read, it seems like the sort of Act 3 falling out thing is a bit of a staple of the genre. I have to say, it's always my least favorite part in these books. In all three of the Brown sisters books, it has been my least favorite part. But I think here, this was the one that felt most real. It made most sense, and it was dealt with in a timely sort of way. It didn't linger. It sort of didn't feel exaggerated. It felt like it made sense for the characters, and the resolution was quick enough that I still believed in their love. But overall, this book just worked so well. These characters are just perfection. They're perfection together. The sex scenes are amazing. Like everything about it is just... it's just heartwarming and wonderful. I loved it, and I loved this series. The only thing I'm sad about is that there weren't 15 Brown sisters and we didn't get 15 books or more. I'd be happy with more. Overall though, this was just adorable, sweet, and super hot, and I spent the entire book grinning like a fool. My fifth favourite book of the year is Billy Ardalung Darai by Anita Heiss. Now this is another book that I don't have with me at the moment because I've lent it out to a friend. I am lending to this to anyone who will let me put it in their hands because it is that good. I want everyone to read it. Funnily enough, I actually gave this book only 4 stars, 4.5 stars, I think, when I first read it. But I loved it so much, and the things that kind of bothered me immediately after reading it bother me much less now that I have a bit of distance from it. But it's still a book that stayed with me. It's still one that I think about. It's still one that I know I can reliably recommend and people will enjoy. And it's just such a beautiful book that in my mind it now is a 5-star. I don't know if you ever have that where like your star rating sometimes does fluctuate a little bit once you've had time to marinate with the emotional response of a book. And I think that's certainly true for this one. Like I loved this book when I read it. It was a standout. But I have only grown to love it more and more and more over the months since I finished it. The title of this book, Billy Ardalung Darai, is Wiradjuri for River of Dreams. And there is quite a lot of Wiradjuri language throughout the book, which I think is beautifully done. Basically, it's an historical fiction set in, I think, the mid-1800s in Australia, in a town called Gundagai. And basically it follows a young Wiradjuri girl, a young Aboriginal girl called Wogadine, who is a servant to a white colonial family in the area. And she, I think, might be my favorite character I read all year. She is the absolute beating heart of this book, and the way that Anita Heiss brought her to life and made her feel so just genuine and sweet and authentic, but still so strong, and just all of the things. She was the most memorable character for me from 2021. She was just incredible. And basically throughout the novel, we just follow Wogadine and her experience of being a servant to this family, and sort of the traumas and difficulties she goes through. One of the really interesting parts of the book, I think, is that the wife of the family considers herself sort of like a good white person. Like she doesn't believe in the way that the Aboriginal people are treated. She fights for, or she talks about fighting for their rights and all of that sort of stuff. But you see her sort of, I don't know, like say one thing and do another. And so it's just a really interesting portrayal of white privilege in that particular context as well. And also of the very, very interesting dynamic and like complexity of being a white woman in that situation with both a lot of power but also a lot of oppression. Even though Anita Heiss builds up these incredible characters with this really rich, full description of the time and place, her language is still very accessible, even with the incorporation of Wiradjuri. The way that it's incorporated is seamless. It's beautifully done. It's a really easy book to read. Like, I read it quite quickly. The pacing, especially in the first like 3/4 of the book, is perfection. The only criticism I had of this book, and I think is the reason why I gave it 4 stars at the time of reading, is the ending. It just felt a little bit rushed. Like, we had so much time with these characters and everything. Like, the pacing honestly was just perfect, point for point for point, the entire way through the book. And then just the last like 3rd quarter of the book, it just felt a little bit rushed. And so I think like this book would have been my favorite book of the year had the ending sort of just had a little bit more space to be what it was. Like, I didn't necessarily need the ending to change, like the actual events and how it happened. Just allow us as the reader a bit more space and time with the ending, if that makes sense. That's all I wanted from this book. But like I said, having had a couple of months space or several months space with this book, like, my memories of it are only incredibly positive. Like, I still tear up thinking about Wagadyne. I still feel the emotional impact of that story and how powerful and beautiful and sensual it all was, and how heartbreaking it was too. Like, that story has stayed with me. And like I said, I don't have it with me now because I keep lending it out. And every time I've lent it out and someone's brought it back to me, they've told me they loved it. So it's a great book. Book number 5. This is Carpentaria by Alexis Wright. Now, this book I actually did include in a reading vlog. So if you'd like to see my experience going through this book, you can see that in the video. I'll leave a link to it in the description box below for you. This was not an easy book for me to read. And honestly, like, if I was just basing it solely on reading enjoyment, this book wouldn't be on the list. But in terms of a piece of art, an accomplishment of a book, of something that has just absolutely left a mark on me and stayed with me, both as a reader and just as a human, this book is absolutely up there. I think this is the Australian book you need to read. I know it's huge, and like, even this doesn't give justice to like how dense it is. Like, it will take you twice as long as you expect to read it, I think, at least. But it's just one of the best books I've ever read. Maybe not one of my most favorite, but it is absolutely one of the best. I'm honestly not even going to talk too much about the plot because that is not what has stayed with me, and it's almost the plot is not the point. I don't know how else to put it. This book is almost like a fever dream. The way that it's written, it's so dense and foggy. It almost feels like you're not ever quite sure what's real and what isn't. But at the same time, it's not fantastical and airy-fairy. It is so grounded and feels almost brutish sometimes in how harsh the conditions that some of these people live in, and how like literally graphic some of the violence that we have to read about is. It's so real, and yet it's so mystical. It's essentially a story of tension, of racial tension, of gender tension, of class tension, of the tension between occupier and settler and the occupied. It's a really difficult book to read. To me, this book almost feels like the epic mythology of Australia. Like, it feels like an analogy for the tension and the context of Australia as a whole, and like the tension underpinning our society. But it feels so grand as well. Like, it feels like our epic tale, like of our time and place. Like, this is our archetypal myth. Ultimately, whatever Alexis Wright has done is just brilliant, and it results in the most beautiful, devastating exploration of race, of masculinity, of grief, of family, and ultimately of resilience. And the ending was absolutely worth every little piece of work. Not because it has some huge climactic moment, or just the message and the feeling it left me with. I don't know how to describe it. It just was an incredible experience, and an experience I think, I don't want to say every Australian, but I think most Australians should have this experience. I think you need to have this experience. It's just second to none. My fourth favorite book of the year was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Kawaguchi. I love this book, and honestly I could put the second book, like the follow-up, the sequel, in along here with it, because I think the sequel, it's so similar to the first book. Like, it's essentially just extending the premise. Like, if you like this one, you'll like the second one. If you don't like this one, you won't like the second one. Basically, this is a set of 4 different stories all occurring in this small cafe in Tokyo. And it's a small sort of dingy little cafe where you can go and you can get a cup of coffee, and a lot of people do, but you can also travel in time. There are a lot of rules around how and where and when you can travel in time though. Like, it's all very specific. Like, basically you can only travel like within the cafe, you can't go somewhere else. And you only have a few minutes. You have to be back before your coffee gets cold, or there are some pretty dire consequences. And throughout this, we basically get 4 different stories of 4 different people who decide to travel back in time, all to sort of meet one person. And it is so sentimental. Almost, I mean, maybe for some people's taste, it's just a bit too much. But for me, like, the heart and the warmth and the almost whimsical charm of it, like, it won me over almost immediately. And I do like how we also get to know the staff who work at the cafe. So there is that sort of continuity throughout the 4 stories, and including in the second book as well. Like, we get to know a certain like core cast of characters. I just found it so touching, like heartbreaking, but also so heartwarming and sweet, and just, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It's a very, very quick read. And like I said, I've never sobbed harder. I have never sobbed harder while reading a book than I have with this one. My third favourite book of the year was Friends in Dark Shapes by Kavita Bedford. This is a debut novel by an Australian author, and Kavita Bedford is now an auto-buy, auto-read author for me. This was incredible. This book is told in a series of vignettes, and it basically covers, I think, a year in the life of our main character after her father has died. So she's sort of just processing the grief, the loss of her father, as well. Like, there's sort of flashbacks to experiences that she had with her father, but also a lot of it is just about sort of being a millennial in Sydney. It feels very much like Sydney is a part of this story, and I loved that. I loved how in-placed it felt. The writing in this is just divine. Absolutely beautiful. And because it's told in vignettes, it just sort of feels like you get these little snapshots throughout her year, whether it be a memory that she's having or like a moment with her housemates or whatever. It feels so real, but it's so tender. And honestly, it was so well executed that I had to keep reminding myself that this was a debut novel, because I just felt like I was in such good hands, you know, like it felt so masterful that I almost could not believe that this is a young debut author. On top of the grief and the loss of her father, other themes that are explored are like gentrification, as well as just like what it's like to be a millennial. Like, you know, in prior generations, the more idea of, you know, settling down with and having a family. Instead, she's turning 30 and she's still got housemates, and they're all sort of still trying to find their way, and just like that very different generational experience. It also spoke a lot about the experience of growing up, and identity, being like first generation, and also how like the racial experience from different perspectives. Like she does, like I think her family's Indian from memory. Like it's been a while since I read this, but like her experience and her father's experience, but then also acknowledging the fact that she lives on stolen land. It's all very nuanced and subtle. Like it's like not overtly a political book. I think it's a very millennial book. And I think a lot of millennials do have just like a sense of awareness of these sort of things. And this character certainly does too. Ultimately, it felt heartbreaking and so hopeful. I loved it. It stayed with me, and almost immediately I knew that this was going to be a favorite for me. Like reading through it, just the language and the tenderness and the emotions and the way that they're all explored was just perfection. And then once I'd finished, like I just didn't want it to be over, and I'm just so sad that in some ways that she is a debut novelist, because I want more. That was my first impulse, was to go and find more just like this. And I did try. I found a few books that were like recommended if you liked this. They had nothing on Dark Shapes, like Friends in Dark Shapes. This was just incredible. My second favourite book of the year is also one I don't have here to show you because, again, I'm lending it out to a friend. But it is There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Tsumura, translated by Polly Barton. In this book, we basically follow our female protagonist who is sort of like an older millennial, I would say. She's had a burnout from work previously, and so she's sort of like had a couple of years off, I think, sort of recovering. And now she's ready to get back out there and get a new job. But she's very adamant that she doesn't want a hard job. She doesn't want a job that is complicated or emotionally draining or anything. She just wants to be able to show up, clock in, do an easy job, and go home. And the book is basically us following her as she goes through several different jobs. And she finds herself again and again getting invested despite herself. So it's a pretty mundane story, but there are little elements here and there of, I don't know if they're quite on the level of magical realism, but they're just a little bit of the unexplained, a little bit unusual, and we're never really sure if it's like, you know, like how real it is or whatever. Like there's just little elements that make it just a little bit absurd. The narrator herself, I adored her. She was messy, she was vulnerable, she was anxious, she was funny, she was so expressive. And I suppose this is where I have to admit that I think I love this book so much based on a very, very subjective reason. Like I just very much identified with this character and her experience. I think like obviously there are differences, but I am also a millennial, so I identified with some generational issues. And I also like had kind of like a health crisis that meant that I had a complete 180 on the career that I thought I wanted and I thought I would have. It resulted in me wanting very different work and feeling very like capable of very different work, having different priorities around work and how I existed in the world. I know that some people have had very different readings and interpretations of this book, and I'm admitting full well that this might just be borderline projection on my part. But for my experience, I just adored the reading experience. I loved every moment of it. I devoured it in just over a day, I think, and it's not a slim book. I personally found it so relatable and also like honest and vulnerable, but also so affirming and like life affirming. It felt celebratory in a way. And even though I think when I first picked up this book, I was expecting it to be a bit more like Convenience Store Woman, like have a bit more of like a critique of like capitalism and like the economy and like the expectations on millennials and stuff. It wasn't really that. Like it was sort of situated in that context, but that's not what the book was about, or at least what the book was about to me. To me, this was much more of a personal journey of this one person just trying to figure out how to live a meaningful life and what that meant to her. And given me and my own lived experience and my own journey, it just hit me right in the feels. Like that book spoke to me and I adored it. I absolutely adored it. And before I tell you what my absolute favorite book was of the year, honestly, like these top three, Friends in Dark Shapes, There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job, and this next one, I do go back and forth on. I really love them all. I think they are all like new favorite authors, like people that I want to read more from. But I'm not going to drag this on any further. Book number one. My absolute favorite book of the year has to be Emrita by Banana Yoshimoto. Unlike a lot of the other books where I loved them so much I couldn't put them down, this felt a bit more of a slow burn for me. I really took my time with it, and it's like I wanted to take my time with it. This book follows a woman and her family. She has had a head injury that has resulted in some memory loss for her. Also happening in her family is that her sister has passed away quite recently. Her father passed away as well. So what remains of her family is a bit of a quirky mix of people. She has a younger brother, she has a mother, she has like this weird auntie who hangs around. And again, this is one of those books that's not really about the plot. It is absolutely about the characters and, for me, the writing. And I think of all of these books, this might be the one that I would be less likely to recommend, maybe, because I think this is very, very like a personal taste sort of thing. I have heard people say that they hate the translation on this. Actually, who's this by? Translated by Russell F. Wasden. And even for lovers of Banana Yoshimoto, because I know she has a massive cult following, this is quite unusual for her. Like, it's a much longer book. It's a very different style to a lot of the other books that she's so well known for. And I have read a couple of other Banana Yoshimoto books. I want to read more, but this is so far by far my favorite. This is an all-time new favorite book for me. Like, it's up there. And basically it's a book that's kind of about a lot of things, but also about nothing, and also about everything. There are a number of pretty significant events that do occur and sort of keep the book moving in terms of plot. And often those events are quite tragic, but the book is never really about those moments. Instead, the book much more like it zooms in on the moments in between, of like the mundane getting on with life in between the big moments. There is also like a bit of magic going on, like there's some ghosts, there's telepathy happening. But again, it's there, but it's not the focus. Like, this is not a fantasy novel. Instead, the focus is on personal interactions, on street food, on sunsets, on memories. I think I said in my vlog that just the way that Banana Yoshimoto merged, balanced, I don't know, like simultaneously expressed the beauty, the awe with the grief and the tragedy of life. I found absolutely moving. And I cried my entire way through this book because it was just so beautiful and so sad. Like those two things all at once in equal measure, exactly. It was just perfection. I loved it. I loved it so much. I have absolutely found like a new favorite book, a new favorite author in Banana Yoshimoto and Emrita. I loved it. So those are my top 10 favorite books of 2021. Obviously, these are books that I read in 2021, not that were necessarily released in 2021, although some of them were, many of them were not. But I do feel like I had a pretty good reading year last year. I found some absolutely incredible books, ones that I am like excited and proud to recommend to people and to friends. And obviously Banana Yoshimoto and Kavita Bedford and Samura are just like some authors that I desperately want to read more from. I mean, at least with Banana Yoshimoto, she has a big back catalogue, so I'm working my way through it. But with the other two, well, Samura, that is her only book published, like translated into English, and Kavita Bedford, it's a debut. So I'm like, I'm just desperate for more. But yeah, these were just some absolutely incredible books. I would love to hear them in the comments below what your favorite books of 2021 were. And I will see you in a video soon talking about some of my other favorites and maybe some of my not so favorites. Until then, so much love and happy reading. Bye.